2 of our Fundamentals of Psychedelics lecture series. My name is Grace Lee, and I'm the co-chair of Psychedelic Studies Imperial, alongside Nemo, who I'm sure you'll be meeting in the later weeks. Today, we are delighted to host Professor David Nutt. And before we introduce him, I would like to also introduce you to our new committee member, Michael Angus, who has stepped up to take on the role of Journal Club lead. And now he'll tell you a little bit about that before we begin.
Hello, everyone. So just to touch on some things with how the format of this journal club will be. The plan for this journal club is for one person each week to do the heavy lifting so that the rest of the group can benefit from their discoveries. Each week, there will be one presenter who has read a paper related to psychedelic research, and I'm hoping to establish a relaxed discussion format so that there won't be a huge pressure to make a perfect presentation, as long as there are slides and figures for us to view while we learn together. We will have a list of papers for volunteers to choose from, but if you have your own paper, you can let us know and we can approve and schedule it. The Journal Club will be meeting every Monday from 6 to 7 p.m., starting this next Monday. The link for that Zoom meeting will be sent out in the mailing list over the next couple of days, so keep your eyes out. The first meeting will be to orient the group and assign at least the first few weeks of papers to volunteers, and you don't have to present a paper to be a member or participate in discussion. You're welcome to join, but it is strongly encouraged because we need people to share. So keep your eyes out for that email, and I hope to see you all Monday. And now to introduce our speaker for the evening. Professor David Nutt is currently the Edmund J. Safra Professor of Neuropsychopharmacology and head of the Center for Neuropsychopharmacology and director of the Center for Psychedelic Research in the Division of Brain Science at Imperial College London. During his career, he has moved through fields of neurology, psychiatry, and psychopharmacology, publishing over 500 original research papers, a similar number of reviews and books chapters, 8 government reports on drugs, and 35 books, including one for the general public that you may have heard of called Drugs Without the Hot Air, which won the Transmission Book Prize in 2014 for communication of ideas. The second edition of this book, if you're interested, has just been released, and it has his autobiography, Nutt Uncut. His contributions to psychopharmacology have been in topics such as GABA and noradrenaline receptor function in anxiety disorders, serotonin function in depression, endorphin and dopamine function in addiction, and most recently, focusing his attention on the neuroscience and clinical utility of psychedelic drugs. He is currently chair of Drug Science, a charity that tells the truth about drugs, and with which he runs the well-known Drug Science podcast, covering matters of drug science and policy. He has appeared widely on radio and television, including BBC programs, Channel 4 documentaries, films, and plays. He is much in demand for public affairs programs on therapeutic as well as illicit drugs, their harms and their classification, and the relationship between scientists and government. He also lectures widely to the public as well as to the scientific and medical communities, which is why we are so lucky as to have him joining us tonight. So I'll now pass it over to Dr. Nutt to tell us about the history of psychedelic drug policies.
It's great to be talking to you all, and it's wonderful that there's such a thing as a psychedelic society at Imperial. There wasn't when I joined 12 years ago, but I think it's going from strength to strength, and I'm glad to be helping facilitate that. So I guess you're all kind of well aware of the drugs we're talking about and the sources of these drugs. I just wanted to say a couple of words about 2 of them. Amanita muscaris here, which is often overlooked psychedelic mushroom, largely because it's not a serotonergic one. And that's, I think, going to be becoming interesting in the next few years, because it actually is, in most countries, still legal and hopefully will remain that way. But it produces a rather different effect to the classic psilocybin and ayahuasca, etc. But on the left-hand side, this is the image I find most intriguing, and this is a 3,000-year-old Greek vase, and it shows a noble person partaking of ergot. And ergot is a fungus that grows on cereals, and the ancient Greeks used to delay having their holidays to the autumn, when the dew started to settle on the cereal crops, the ergot fungus would then grow. The Greeks didn't realize it was a fungus. They thought it was part of the cereal itself. And then they would eat the ergot, which of course has psychedelic properties, and drink wine and partake in what they called their mysteries. And these mysteries were cultural events with dance and music and other activities, debate, discussion, which they used to formulate ideas and to help refresh them from the long hot summers living in their cities. And then they went back to the city-states and then carried on doing what the Greeks have been rather good at doing, such as creating the constructs such as geometry, logic, and theatre, and also the concept of democracy. And I think it's completely credible that these psychedelic experiences that they engaged with in their mysteries led to this massive explosion of cultural and scientific awareness, which, as we all know, really underpin the whole of Western society today. So maybe psychedelics have left their impression on us from a very long time ago. Magic mushrooms, the Amanita mushroom rather, also is likely to have had a role in the development or the sustaining of Christianity. And these are some the church largely tried to get rid of, but you can make quite an interesting case that the resilience of the early Christians, particularly in the face of the attempts to eliminate them by a whole series of Roman emperors, might be down to the fact that they use the Amanita muscaris mushroom. And the argument for that is very, very well described in this book here, The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross by John Allegro. He was a Manchester University academic who researched the use of words relating to mushrooms and psychedelics in the Bible, and came to the conclusion that they were widely used. And evidence for that you can see in some of these residual motifs here. The key message, and this is perhaps why it has been eliminated from much of subsequent discourse. The key message is that the tree of life in the Garden of Eden was actually an Amanita mushroom rather than an apple tree. And of course, that makes a lot more sense because apple trees hadn't been discovered at the beginning of time. They were cultivated subsequently. So you can see examples that refer to this. This is a very famous mosaic in northern Italy. But the most remarkable one, I think, is this. This is the Canterbury Psalter. This is one of the great books available still today in describing the formation of the earth and the seas, etc. The 7 days of creation, and I think it is, what is it? The third day God created plants, and it's quite interesting, isn't it, that the plants He created were all mushrooms. The reality is, from Allegro's work, it seems that early Christians used Amanita for, I think, bonding and survival reasons, in the same way as South Latin American churches use ayahuasca-containing drinks. But when the church morphed in the 11th and 12th centuries from being a collection of believers to a financially driven institution, there was a systematic attempt to eliminate all records of the mushroom cult, as they called it. But luckily, they didn't get rid of them all. And I think it is important to consider that it might have been really influential in those first 1,000 years of Christianity. Let's fast forward now to the near modern era, or the beginnings of what you might call the psychological era. And here's William James, who was one of the great founding fathers of the discipline of psychology. And he used mescaline and he used nitrous oxide. And he realized that they produced profound alterations in his brain and or in his mind. And he then wrote this: our normal waking consciousness is but one special type of consciousness, whilst all about it, parted from it by the filmiest of screens, there lie potential forms of consciousness entirely different. So he'd experienced those. And then he realized, and this I just think is one of the great challenges to science. No account of the universe in its totality can be final. That leaves these disregarded. What a challenge he's laying down to us. To understand altered consciousness, including that produced by drugs, is a fundamental challenge for science. But he couldn't study them. As he said, how to regard them is the question, for they're so discontinuous with ordinary consciousness. And a lot of our work, which we'll hear about from others, I'm sure, in my group over the next few weeks, has been directed at using modern technology that we have and he didn't have to study them. Now, as I said, James, we believe, used mescaline, which was really the first psychedelic to enter into serious West study in the Western world. So here's a picture of mescaline, and there's the scientist, the chemist Arthur Hefter, who identified it as the active ingredient in peyote in the 1890s. And there's an institute called the Hefter Institute which celebrates his discovery and gives funding to research funds for psychedelic research. They supported us in the very early days of our imaging research. And this is a wonderful book by Mike Jay. Mike Jay is a great writer who is extremely knowledgeable about a whole range of psychoactive substances. And this is a wonderful book on mescaline, which tells you all about it. I suppose the next real advance in terms of the literature or the writing about psychedelics came in the 1950s with Aldous Huxley. And an interesting man, he was the older stepbrother of Andrew Huxley. And those of you who are in the audience who know about physiology and know that Andrew Huxley got the Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine in 1960 for discovering how nerve action potentials work. This Huxley, Aldous Huxley, wanted to be a doctor, but his eyes were so bad that he couldn't. So that's why he's often shown wearing these pebble glasses. But he then moved into studying literature, but was always very, very interested in science. And he wrote, of course, a series of books which effectively portray the use of pharmacology and also latterly psychology, particularly in Ireland, to explore their value to humans. Now, most people know of his dystopian book, Brave New World, and some people know The Doors of Perception and Heaven and Hell, his psychedelic diaries, effectively. Most people don't know about Ireland, which is his attempt to essentially lay down a roadmap for the use of psychedelics and appropriate interventional psychology and psychotherapy and behavioral therapy to lead to a better world. So let's look a little bit at his experience with mescaline, and which he wrote about in The Doors of Perception. And what you may not know, and certainly what I didn't know until I started reading this 10, 12 years ago, was that this term, the title, The Doors of Perception, were taken from this quote from William Blake. Now, William Blake is an English painter, a philosopher, a mystic. He wrote the words to the song. He wrote a narrative which is called Jerusalem, which was turned into music by William Parry. And Blake, like many great artists, could see things differently from the rest of us. And Blake said this: if the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite. For man has closed himself up till he sees all things through narrow chinks of his cavern. And Huxley realized that what mescaline had done to him was open up his doors of perception. And he quoted Blake to explain what the doors of perception are. And then he came up with this remarkable insight. If mescaline opened up his mind, something must have been closing it. What was closing it? The brain. And what is so beautiful about the research you'll learn about subsequently from others is that, you know, our research and others have shown that he's exactly right. The brain is an instrument, not just for focusing the mind, but for controlling and often distorting the mind. And for those of you who aren't neuroscientists, let me just introduce to you this concept of how the brain creates the mind. And we'll do it with an example of vision. So whatever you see is not taken, your brain doesn't take a photograph of what you see. What you see, the photons from what you see go into your eye, and then in the retina, in a series of different layers of neurons, they're turned into neural impulses. So the light goes into impulses, the impulses go up the optic nerve into different parts of the brain, and the different parts of the brain, the visual cortex, has different subregions. They pull together those electrical impulses into an estimate of what you're actually seeing. So what you see is a reconstruction by the brain made from the electrical impulses that it's getting. And the brain is extremely efficient. It's 10 times more efficient than the best computer we have today. And that's because it doesn't continuous real-time upgrading of what it sees or hears or thinks. It estimates what's there. So it predicts. And unless things change, it doesn't bother to upgrade. Why would it? If you're seeing a picture of me now, as some of you will be, your brain has already worked out it's me. And if I was to turn into a tiger during the talk, you probably wouldn't notice, because that's so unlikely that your brain wouldn't even think it could happen. So the brain is efficient because it's basically only interested in things that are likely to happen and likely to change. And that's why, for most of us, we only see things through the chinks of our cavern. Basically, Blake was saying that humans really have a very focused view of the world. They don't see the bigger picture at all. But that focused view of the world might be quite pleasant. You're looking out of the chinks of your cavern, and you generally, most of us will see blue sky and nice white clouds and something that's sort of positive and enjoyable. But depressed people, when they look out the chinks of their cavern, what they see is a grey, miserable world. And people with addictions, what they see is largely focused on their desired objects, such as the bottle or the syringe. And this distortion of perception, which occurs in disorders like addiction and depression, is imposed upon the mind by the brain. And there's another wonderful quote from Blake. And he talked about our mind-forged manacles, how we make the chains that lock us into whatever we're doing. And the only thing I would say that's not quite right about that is that quite a lot of the manacles are determined by the brain. Not all of them, some of them are determined by the mind. The real revolution in psychedelic research came with the discovery in 1943 of this derivative of ergot. So this is the ergot molecule, and as you probably all know, that what Hoffman did was bung on these two extensions, diethylamide extensions, to make it a more potent and longer acting substance. But the very year that Hoffman discovered LSD, the atom bomb, the first atom bomb, was exploded. And you could argue, and I will argue, that these are perhaps the two most important scientific events in the 20th century, and they both came pretty much at the same time. You might not have ever seen an atom bomb because it doesn't look like the usual picture of atomic explosions, and that's because it's not a hydrogen bomb. So here's LSD, and here's the man that discovered it, Albert Hofmann. And here he is at 100, celebrating his 100th birthday, sitting in his villa overlooking Lake Geneva. I think it's been color-coded by some of the more romantically inclined fans of his. He took LSD on a regular basis and lived to 102. And the first British psychiatrist or scientist probably to take LSD was Joel Elkes in 1952. He was professor of experimental psychiatry at the University of Birmingham. He went on to lead a big institute in the States. And he lived to 103. And, you know, so I think we can quickly put to bed the argument that has been subsequently put out as a justification for banning these drugs, that they actually damage your brain. And in fact, one begins to wonder whether they actually might have some properties to minimize damage to the brain, but that's another story. Now, Hofmann was so entranced by the impact of LSD on him that he persuaded his company, Sandoz, to make it available to researchers around the world. And here are two Nobel Prize winners whose lives were powerfully affected by LSD. The one on the left is Francis Crick, who with Jim Watson discovered basically the blueprint of life, the double helix DNA. And on the right is Kerry Mullis. You might not know who Kerry Mullis is, but he's the guy that discovered the PCR reaction, polymerase chain reaction, which of course, you know, any of you who do biology know that is the fundamental reaction in almost all of life sciences. So Kerry Mullis was a biochemist in California at the time, trying to work out how he could study DNA, this wonderful new discovery that Crick and Watson had made. And he recounts on one day he was taking an LSD trip, and then he saw this helical molecule unraveling in front of him like a series of serpents, which is a kind of image that's not uncommon in people who are using ayahuasca, particularly Native Americans often hope to and do see images of serpents, and they have a religious connotation. But for Kerry, what he realized was if he could reproduce the coils of DNA, he could get enough of it to measure it and work out whether it was different in different disorders or different species, etc. And he set about to find an enzyme to reproduce it, and he did. He found one called polymerase, and the rest is history. And he got the Nobel Prize. And he said, I would never have gotten the Nobel Prize if I hadn't seen with LSD that power of what I needed to do to get to grips with DNA. What Crick? You think, well, you get the Nobel Prize, you've sorted out the meaning of, you know, the origins of life. What to do next? And in fact, he helped Sanger get 2 Nobel Prizes for decoding proteins in mRNA. But when he took LSD, he realized that actually understanding how life reproduces is actually a pretty trivial thing. He'd already done that. Understanding how the brain works is considerably more complicated. And I think he would agree with this statement from Einstein. No problem can be solved from the same level of consciousness that created it. And I think both of those Nobel Prize winners would probably endorse that statement, that altered consciousness had a huge impact on their thinking about their careers. And in fact, it was so influential for Crick that probably because we were clamping down on LSD use in the late 1960s in Britain, and his parties in Cambridge were quite famous, he left Britain and he went to the States where he could kind of disappear a bit and not be subject to the possibility of being arrested. And then he spent the last 30 years of his life writing about the brain and studying the brain. And he said this: there is no scientific study more vital to man than the study of his own brain. Our entire view of the universe depends on it. Of course, that is, to us now, that is absolutely self-evident because neuroscience has evolved so rapidly in those last 40 years. But he wrote this book, The Astonishing Hypothesis, which was trying to explain to people that actually the soul, which people still then and probably do now, believe was some kind of spirit that floats through the body was actually a product of the brain. And he was very interested in where consciousness came from. And working with Thomas Koch, they came to the idea that consciousness came out of the claustrum. The claustrum was a thin layer of cells which underlies the cortex, most parts of the cortex. And in fact, it does have a role in consciousness. It certainly has a role in arousal and attention. And it turns out, since he's died, that some forms of altered consciousness are almost certainly driven by changes in activity in the claustrum, because the claustrum is loaded with kappa receptors, and kappa receptors are the receptors that salvia divinorum works on. So now we know that the salvia experience is not the same as the traditional psilocybin or LSD experience, but it is a psychedelic experience, and that may be that it tells us that the claustrum does have some role in some aspects of consciousness, but not quite the same role as other parts of the cortex. And the enthusiasm that Hoffman had and his company had for LSD led it to be being used all around the world. About 1,000 researchers were given access to Delicid, the trade name for LSD tablets, 25 milligram tablets. And it was used to model psychosis. It was used by mental health professionals to understand what it's like to have altered forms of consciousness. And it was used in psychotherapy. It was used in two sorts of psychotherapy: the psychedelic psychotherapy, which is what we do today generally. It's a high dose, produce a powerful experience, a mystical or peak experience, and out of which people come with insights and change. And that was favored in the US. And then it was used for psycholytic psychotherapy, which was favored in Britain. That's a lower dose, a non-psychedelic dose, but a dose that loosens up people's psychological resistances. So it's not a microdose, it's a midi dose. And that was given before each psychotherapy session to allow people to better access their repressed emotions and thoughts and memories. And it was massively studied. It was the first true research tool for the mind. The US government, through its National Institute of Health, funded over 130 grants. It was seen as the revolution. It was basically the key to the brain. 1,000 papers were published, 40,000 patients were studied, 40 books, 6 international conferences. And subsequently, in 1971, the results were collated in this book by Masters and Houston. And overall, the results were remarkable. They were positive outcomes, and the treatment was seen as safe and effective. And psychiatrists, many psychiatrists thought this was the future. And here are two of them. This is Ronnie Lang here, a very famous anti-psychiatrist, but he wasn't really an anti-psychiatrist. He just wanted to do psychiatry differently. And he said he gave this advice to people who want to become a psychoanalyst: read the works of Freud, undergo personal analysis, and take LSD. And Humphrey Osborne was a British psychiatrist who went to Canada. He was a man that actually gave LSD to Huxley, and then he went on to run the Maryland State Psychiatric Institute. He said this: "To sink in hell or soar angelic, you'll need a pinch of psychedelic." And here are some analyses of the data, largely on LSD, some on psilocybin. And vast numbers of people were treated, vast numbers were monitored, and the outcomes were favorable, and the risks, the adverse effects, were very low. Low rates of psychosis, low rates of suicide. These rates are lower than you'd probably expect in that population who didn't get any treatment at all. So overall, there was very little evidence of harm. But there was harm. Some of the harm was generated by this attempt, this very famous program, MKUltra, to use LSD to essentially brainwash people, to see if you could use it to, in reality, what they were trying to do was take Russian and North Korean prisoners and turn them against communism in favor of the American way of life. It failed, but they sucked in some very, very powerful psychiatrists, Gottlieb and Cameron, who was actually a Canadian, And these experiments were done unethically. It wasn't illegal at the time, but they certainly didn't get ethical permission. And they've managed to destroy most of the results. And but we know it was a complete abuse of the power of both psychiatry and neurology. And it gave the drugs a very bad name because people assumed that it was, when it became known that it was the bad effects would be replicated in the world. And one of the tricks was for instance, was to spike people's drinks with LSD without telling them, so that they could see what the reaction was. And often it was very, very distressing to the person who was poisoned. Now, in the 1960s, a very interesting development occurred in relation to alcoholism. And it was this man here, Bill Wilson. Now, Bill Wilson founded Alcoholics Anonymous. And he had a powerful psychedelic trip during withdrawal. And he got it from atropine, which is a bit like scopolamine. And scopolamine can produce very strange hallucinations, rather different from traditional psychedelics. But then he went on to use LSD, and he began to realize that LSD could be the key to unlocking what he called cynical alcoholics, failure, resistance to experiencing or accepting there's more to life than alcohol, to give them a spiritual awakening, to break them free from alcohol. And I think this description of his trip, in which he escaped alcoholism, is really remarkable. Suddenly, the room lit up with a great white light. I was caught up in an ecstasy which there are no words to describe. It seemed to me, in my mind's eye, that I was on a mountain, and that a wind, not of air, but of spirit, was blowing. And then it burst upon me that I was a free man. His shackles of his alcoholism were burst. Now, for a time, I was in another world, a new world of consciousness, and I thought to myself, so, this is the God of the preachers. A great peace stole over me. And that kind of transcendental experience with psychedelics, of course, could be very, very helpful in getting people to change the whole way in which they view drugs like alcohol. And he championed the use of LSD. He got the US government to fund 6 trials. And a few years ago, these 2 Norwegians went and collected the data and did what we call a meta-analysis, putting it all together. And they showed that the effect size of LSD is about 1. And that's much bigger than any current therapies for alcoholism, which effect size is around about 0.3, 0.4. And you think, wow, this is a remarkable treatment. And I've estimated, very conservatively, that since LSD has been banned in 1967, probably 100 million people worldwide have died from alcohol-related disorder. And if LSD only helped 10% of them, that would be 10 million lives saved. And then you think, well, how many lives have been saved by the banning of LSD? Possibly none, but let's say some, maybe 10 a year, maybe 1,000. So we've got 10 million on one side of the equation and 1,000 on the other. And you don't need to even understand maths to know that the lost opportunities from the ban completely disproportionate to the benefits. This man, Stan Grof, carried on working underground with psychedelics when they were banned, and also he developed other approaches to alter consciousness like holotropic breathwork. And he said this: psychedelics, used responsibly and with proper caution, would be for psychiatry what the microscope is for biology and medicine, or the telescope is for astronomy. And that's essentially what Hoffman was saying as well. But the 1950s were a very, very strange time. I was born in the 50s. I grew up in the 50s. I remember these images of hydrogen bombs being very, very common. And the concept of madness, mutually assured destruction, was there all the time. The bottom line is, if you kill us, we'll kill you. We can wipe the world out. There were enough hydrogen bombs to destroy pretty much all life immediately without all the consequences of the nuclear winter and radiation poisoning. And it was a weird time. And I can remember still in the 50s having the sirens going off to warn us, to prepare us if there was going to be a nuclear attack. It was pretty distressing. And then, of course, the 50s morphed into the 60s, and in the 60s we had the Vietnam War. And despite the overwhelming military power that America put into that war, with gunships and napalm, the war couldn't be won. And that was just another form of absurd madness. And it was an interesting war because it was the first war where the press essentially could tell the truth. It wasn't being suppressed. And this left-hand image is a remarkable image because it's from the Sun, and it's probably the only time the Sun has ever made a sensible comment about anything. But things were so bad, even the Sun wanted to stop the war. And of course, a lot of Americans wanted to stop the war. Here are protests: resist the draft, don't register. And 18-year-old Americans could be signed up to go and fight in Vietnam just because their birthday was an odd date as opposed to an even date. And they'd go to a place they'd never heard of and fight an enemy they'd never see for a cause they never understood. And some of them defected. Some went to Canada and some went to California. And some of them in California started to do things like put flowers in their hair and put flowers down the guns of the state police. But the worst thing they did for the government of America was that they started protesting the war. And this statement at the bottom here, drop acid, not bombs. This was the fundamental challenge to the American way of basically using the military and military might to define itself and its interactions with the world. And LSD was seen as fueling the anti-war movement, which it wasn't. It was simply being used alongside the anti-war movement, but they couldn't stop the anti-war movement, but they could ban LSD. But LSD at the time was also changing culture, and it was dramatically changing music, and also the way music was advertised. And the whole psychedelic art field was extremely threatening to what in the 1960s was still a very puritanical, almost Victorian American, and to some extent a British establishment. And the Brits got in on the act. Some people would say the greatest album ever, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, was multiple psychedelic references in that. And bands like Hawkwind tried to reproduce some of the sensory distortions of psychedelics in their music at a level which is actually, for some people, very disturbing. And psychedelia changed art. It didn't just get the magic bus painted, and if you haven't seen the film, you must see it. It's a remarkable film. But it changed people's perception of what art could be. It moved it into this psychedelic space. And it even changed LSD. Here's LSD reproduced under LSD by an artist under LSD. In fact, LSD became a cultural icon, and that was threatening to the authorities. There it goes, a molecular structure, then it starts to get colored, and then it starts to get eyes, and then it's a tattoo, and it's a t-shirt, and it's a jewelry. And I don't suppose any drug other perhaps than cannabis has actually had such a huge cultural impact in terms of being portrayed and being worn. And it also changed love. It changed the perspective on love. And that was bad enough for a very puritanical society. But worse than that, it changed people from war to love. And that was the fundamental reason these drugs got banned, because it was believed in a completely bizarre way that if you stop people using psychedelics, they would suddenly want to go to war rather than make love. And all you can say is, it truly reflects a complete lack of understanding. And here's Timothy Leary, the man that essentially was the voice of the psychedelic revolution, with his famous strapline, turn on, tune in, drop out. And I would argue that the threat of LSD changing the way people voted was why it got banned. And in fact, I think it's the first drug to be banned simply because it threatened the way people would vote, and they would vote in a more liberal direction. But in those days, in the USA and in Britain, you couldn't ban a drug simply because you didn't like what the people who took it said. So you had to try to find evidence of harms. And basically refusing to fight a war wasn't evidence of harm. Not even free love was not legitimate social harm. So they had to create medical harms to justify banning it. And they did it in the sort of time-honored way. Go to the gutter press, get the gutter press to raise moral outrage and moral concern. And a campaign against LSD was raised. And it is one of the most ridiculous and implausible series of newspaper headlines that there's ever been. Girl gives birth to a frog. LSD flips on my sex voltage. LSD fed ape rapes a TV. I mean, it's just beyond absurd, isn't it? And you'll notice something very common in this, and this is what we saw before with cannabis, and we've seen subsequently with other drugs we've banned, that sex and drugs go together. And if you get middle-aged people thinking that drugs are improving other people's sex lives, they really want to ban it because they're so envious. So this was completely fatuous and fictitious. But because it was on newspapers, that was the evidence of social concern, and it got banned. And it got banned in opposition, in the face of opposition from the most powerful man in the world at the time, Bobby Kennedy, Secretary of State, who would have been president if he hadn't been assassinated. And he's saying to his regulators, he's saying, hang on, why if these clinical LSD projects were worthwhile 6 months ago, we've spent billions of dollars studying them, why aren't they worthwhile now? We keep going around and around. If I could get a flat answer about that, I would be happy. Is there a misunderstanding about my question? He knew he was being lied to, but he could not stop it. He went on to say, I think perhaps we've lost sight of the fact that LSD can be very, very helpful in our society if used properly. In fact, his wife was having LSD therapy at the time, but he couldn't stop it. And the power of bureaucracy, the power of the Drug Enforcement Agency and the CIA to ban things overwhelmed even this power that this man had. And the same happened in Britain. And when LSD was banned, pretty much all other psychedelics were sucked into the ban. Not everyone in every country, but certainly psilocybin was sucked in. DMT was sucked in. Has there ever been a worse example of research censorship? I don't think so. You've got to go back a long way to find anything that might compete. You've got to go back to 1616. That was when the Papal Congregation of the Index, the Pope, banned all books on the Copernican system of astronomy. Copernicus, as you know, was the man who worked out that the Earth was not the center of the universe, but the sun was. And that conflicted with the Catholic Church's teaching. So they banned his books and they executed Bruno for teaching the Copernican system. And they gave Galileo the choice of recant or die. He recanted. That ban lasted nearly 150 years. The ban on psychedelics for researchers effectively lasted over 50 years. And there weren't that many astronomers in those days. And the ones who lived outside of the Catholic provinces could carry on. The Protestant astronomers could carry on studying the skies. So there was still astronomy going on. Whereas every country in the world effectively has signed up to the ban on psychedelics. And hundreds of thousands of clinicians and neuroscientists who might have been able to make use of psychedelics for therapy or for science have been denied access. So I don't think there's any doubt the ban of psychedelics is the worst censorship of research in the history of the world. And if you don't believe me, here's the data. So here you see the massive rise, the number of papers per year for LSD in blue and for psilocybin in red. And then the US ban comes in, the UN ban comes in, and research virtually disappears. There's 2 years here, 1991, when there's not a single paper published on psilocybin. And that's what the governments wanted to do. They wanted to get people to forget these drugs. to pretend they never existed, because that would justify, or at least it would sort of validate the decision to ban them, and also avoid them being confronted with the damage that the ban had done. And this fall off is caused by two reasons. The first is that the US government didn't fund another trial after 1967, having funded all this research. And the second reason is, even if you could get funding from charities or philanthropists, getting access to these drugs is very, very difficult, as we found and others have found. And in fact, for 50 years, the US National Institute of Health has not funded a single study on a psychedelic. However, the good news is that just 2 weeks ago, it agreed to fund a study of psilocybin in tobacco cessation. So at last, the tide is turning. If you want to read more about it, I've written a couple of big reviews, one in Nature Reviews Neuroscience and one in PLOS Biology. This is a freebie, the PLOS Biology. It's a bit simpler, so that's probably the one to start with. And I'm getting to the end of my talk, and I just want to share another quote from Huxley. This wasn't about science, but this was about, well, about truth and about politics. And he said, "Great is truth, but still greater from a practical point of view is silence about truth. By simply not mentioning certain subjects, totalitarian propagandists have influenced opinion much more effectively than they could have by the most eloquent denunciations." And he's absolutely right. And this is why governments wanted to lose any memory of psychedelics, because they knew if they had to start denouncing them, then people like me would protest. I was sacked by the government as the chief drugs advisor in 2009 for saying on BBC radio that LSD was less harmful than alcohol. That was a sacking offense. Absurd, really. But that is the nature of the political system that is desperate not to be shown to have been wrong about decision making on these drugs, and not to be exposed for being dishonest now. And I'm going to finish with this great quote from the philosopher and playwright, novelist George Bernard Shaw. Those who cannot change their minds cannot change anything. And I'm so pleased that you, as a society, have already had your minds changed, and you're going to hopefully promote and encourage changing the minds of your peers and your parents particularly. And just to give a plug for the books that were mentioned at the beginning, Drugs Without the Hot Air and my Nut Uncut autobiography, they make fantastic Christmas presents for your friends and family, and all the proceeds support my charity, Drug Science. So there they are. There's the autobiography, and these are some books you might want to read. Some wonderful books looking at the history of LSD, and also the resurrection. This Michael Pollan has become he's become the new Leary. He's a food writer. He's now writing about mushrooms, but the psychedelic effects of mushrooms in a beautiful way. So thank you, and I'll take questions.
Thank you so much. We have had one question come through already. It's from James Holland, who says, as a final year medical student at Imperial, what practical steps can I and others take to help? And I think firstly, the fact that you're even here attending this talk and educating yourself is a fantastic thing to do to help. But if you have anything to say on that.
Yeah. Well, I can say it's going to be a lot better for you than it was for me. So when I went to medical school, so I went down to Guy's in 1972, and I sat in the lecture by the Professor of Clinical Pharmacology, and he was talking about end-of-life care with opiates, and in those days we used cocaine, Brompton mixture. And I said, well, what about this research using LSD to treat end-of-life experiences? And he looked at me, and you could almost see the black mark appearing in his mind. He said, we don't talk about that. So I spent the last, that's pretty much 45 years trying to get the medical profession to talk about it, and they are now. And So the answer is for you to keep on talking about it, to learn about it. Follow me on Twitter, follow Drug Science on Twitter. Train as a psychiatrist, and then you'll hopefully, by the time you become trained as a psychiatrist, these drugs will be back in where they should be, which is back into medicine.
Yeah, fantastic. And I'm very excited actually about Michael's work in the future. He has his plans that he was telling me at Freshers Fair about setting up his own clinic back in the States in Portland, which is very exciting. We have another question. This is saying, does ADHD medication such as lisdexamfetamine have a comparable safety record to psychedelics?
Oh, lisdexamfetamine is, I think, an extremely safe drug because it's a prodrug. So it doesn't matter how you take it. Even if you inject it intravenously, it still takes 4 to 5 hours to be metabolized to the active ingredient. So it is actually very safe. Yes, I think, if you were to massively overdose on it, it probably wouldn't be very good for you. You'd get cardiovascular effects. But I think clinically, when it's used in the clinical doses, it seems to be very safe. It's obviously gone right through the full regulatory testing in Europe and in the US.
I suppose perhaps they're getting at kind of treating ADHD with psychedelics as an alternative. I don't know if perhaps you could comment on anything about that.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's my own suspicion is that it isn't going to work, but I do know that there is a company that is proposing to use some kind of high microdose of LSD to treat ADHD. Interesting. I mean, if it works, that's fascinating. I can't see how it would or why it should, but if it does, then we just have to reframe our constructs and make some new hypotheses.
Yeah, definitely. I suppose similar to the kind of meditation aspect that has been beneficial with ADHD, similar thought process, perhaps.
Well, okay, yeah, that's interesting. That's not how it's been. That's exactly not how it's been presented commercially. So the commercial message from this company, I can't remember which of these. There's hundreds of these psychedelic companies, and I can't remember. But whichever one is working with the University of Maastricht is talking much more about attentional focusing and a lot less about switching off the default mode network and putting you into a state of meditation. And I'd be actually surprised if the doses they're using would have any impact on the default mode or not. So I don't think it's mimicking meditation. But it's a good point you raise, because the high doses of psychedelics do produce brain imaging, brain connectivity changes similar, particularly in the anterior cingulate region, to meditation.
We have another question saying, great talk. What is the compound found in the ergot fungus that produces its psychedelic effects? And is there current research into it, therapeutic or otherwise?
Yeah, I think it's just ergotamine. Or ergotaminic acid or something. Yeah, it's just it's a relatively weak psychedelic. But it's actually, there were outbreaks of sort of mass psychedelia back in the Middle Ages, because ergot ergot grows on the cereals. But if you harvest the cereals and then you store them and they're still damp, then ergot keeps on growing. And then there used to be outbreaks of what's called St. Vitus's dance. So populations in Europe would be eating this psychedelically infused seeds, either rye or maybe wheat, and they would have kind of communal hallucinatory experiences, often associated with very strange group behavior. I think one of the theories about the Pied Piper of Hamelin is that the population actually were kind of hallucinating as a result of taking the sort of psychedelically poisoned rye. So yeah, there are outbreaks of mass psychedelia, often with some quite serious complications as well, by the way. So the ergot alkaloids don't just they're not as clean as psilocybin or LSD. They also work on noradrenergic receptors in the blood vessels, and they constrict blood vessels. So people would often get severe ischemic damage to their feet and their toes and fingers. Even their noses could sometimes get there. So it was it was a dangerous phenomenon. It wasn't particularly pleasant for them.
We have a question from Laura Harris asking for recommendations on institutions to email looking for a medical elective in the field.
Yeah, well, there's only two places doing psychedelic work in Britain at present. That's us and King's. Yeah, we get enormous numbers of people asking to come and do electives with us, and and we're trying to work. We're literally discussing this afternoon how we can try to be fair to everyone and work out what kind of criteria we could use. But yeah, in principle, we would love to have elective students. So you can write to us if you're I suppose if you're at Imperial yourself, then you could just come and see us.
Another one from James Holland saying, how do you manage your frustration regarding drugs policy, knowing how many people could be helped if it weren't for the limitations imposed for the nefarious reasons you've outlined?
Well, I guess I champion the cause. That's got an active resistance, isn't it? Well, there's no other way of changing things other than fighting back. So that's actually, and that is empowering. And also, in hindsight, we've made real progress. There is now a public debate about the use of psychedelics, resurrecting psychedelics in medicine, and that wasn't, when I was a medical student, that there was no debate. So we've made huge progress. We've actually now got clinical data. We know how they work. So the field is transformed, and it will be. I think the horse, to use the analogy, the horse is bolted. You won't be able to get it back in. We're out. We're in the new world now. It's just a question of how best to use these drugs as medicines, rather than whether they will be. But also, of course, the other answer to the question is I give lots of lectures to enthusiastic people that want to change the world with me, like me.
Somebody's asked, do you think that banning LSD has caused more deaths through miseducation and lack of regulation?
Probably not, because it's so safe anyway. I mean, so I just looked a couple of weeks ago, I thought, let's just see how many deaths this century in Britain attributed to LSD and psilocybin from basically the national statistics. It's one for each. One death in 20 years. I mean, it's just, it's basically they don't kill you. Very, very rare.
Somebody's asked about whether personalized medicine using mRNA to alter genomics, etc., will be an avenue in competition with psychedelics in the future of psychiatric treatment. What your impression is?
Nope.
Yeah.
Personalized medicine in psychiatry. I mean, it's truly. But it's it's great science, but it's not. The brain is way more complicated than you might be able to switch off an immune cell, or maybe even get a heart cell growing a few more calcium channels. But the brain is a system. Brain disorders are system disorders, and they're not disorders that you can seriously interact with it with a single RNA or whatever. It's a misconception of, and it's a huge. But this is why the revolution is coming in terms of psychedelic therapy. There's a revolution in construct, not just in terms of as well as outcome. It's about disrupting, changing circuits, changing systems, rather than simply changing receptors. It's a fundamental reconceptualization of how best to deal with psychiatric and to some extent neurological problems, but more psychiatric.
I think it's useful not to think of treatments in competition with each other either as well. speaking to personalized medicine, one treatment that works for one person doesn't work for another, and it's really just about having as many tools in the bag as possible.
Yeah, but personalized medicine for psychiatry implies that there will be, look, there isn't a genetic lesion with any psychiatric disorder. It's not, none of them are monogenetic. Most of them have hundreds of relevant genes, and it's an interesting myth. I think to be fair, this kind of molecular personalization of medicine is a very easy thing to say. It's a very difficult thing to prove. I was. Most of you weren't born when the human genome was sequenced, and everyone said, "Great, at last, it'll lead to a revolution in medical treatments." As far as I know, it hasn't led to any change in medical treatments at all. It's led to a vast increase in studies of genetics without necessarily turning them into anything. The disorders the Huntington's gene was discovered 30 years ago. We still haven't got treatment. The cystic fibrosis gene, even longer ago, we still haven't got genetic treatment. It's because actually the body's a bit more complicated. It isn't, a gene is just but the starting point of quite a complicated evolutionary pathway, even for a cell. So, yeah, people do it, people believe in it. It's certainly not my lifetime. Probably not in yours either.
I understand that there's some research going on at King's with ayahuasca and the epigenetics influence of ayahuasca on.
Of course.
Yeah, is there some work going on in that with other substances at all? Are you aware of?
Well, every change in the brain is epigenetic. I mean, there's every thought, every memory you've just laid down has some kind of epigenetic basis. So, yeah, quite. But if we look at it at a sort of simpler level, there's no question. Yeah, psychedelics will change not just neural firing, but that neural firing will change gene expression. That gene expression will lead to alterations in synaptic proteins and the generation of new synapses and the generation of new circuits. And one of the interesting things about psychedelics is that they seem to be particularly powerful at generating those new forms of connectivity and plasticity in the brain.
Okay, I think.
Great, so I can go and have
this. Yeah, thank you so much for joining me.
How many were online, by the way, out of interest?
I think we had 11 live, but a lot of people watched it back last week. So we had over 100 people view last week's video. So I think people tend to catch up a bit later.
And where does it go?
Just on our YouTube channel. Oh, we've had another question, actually, if you don't mind.
So hang on, where is it? The YouTube channel is called what? Imperial College Psychedelic?
Yeah, Psychedelic Studies Imperial. Yeah, I can send you a link.
Great. Really good. Send me the link. I will then. Is it public?
Yeah.
Oh well, I'll tweet it then. You'll get hundreds of.
Oh, fantastic! Thank you so much. Sorry. Do you have time for one last question? Is that okay? Let's send through. From your experience in the field, what philosophy of mind do you most agree with, e.g., panpsychism, physicalism?
The scientific one. I'm a neuroscientist. I'm still pretty wedded to the idea that the brain and the mind have got something to do with each other. Yeah, even though they can often be in conflict.
Thank you. I think that's from our co-chair Nemo, who's studying the philosophy of mind horizons. We are hoping to set up a psychedelic studies horizons program at Imperial in the future and work towards that, hopefully. But yes, thank you again so very much for joining us.
It's been an absolute pleasure, and keep up the good work.
Likewise. All the best.